The seam in the stairwell. He lived alone in a middle building on a shallow hill where the asphalt buckled like tired knuckles. People called it the shale block because the lot behind it was nothing but broken stone and weeds. The stairwell ran up its spine like a throat, concrete and iron and motion lights that did not agree with one another except at odd moments. He had learned to time his steps to wake them as he went. The elevator worked when it wanted. The heat clunked to life when the first breath of cold crept down from the ridge. The washing machines took a handful of coins and shook the floor like a passing truck. He had come to know these sounds and their moods the way a person knows a dog's habits. He worked at the print shop down by the river road, the one with the chipped window and the big cutter that made heavy pops when it was in the mood to behave. He handled bulk jobs for the high school and the rec league and a couple of churches. The shop smelled of warm paper and a mineral tartness from the ink. He liked the work. It had the satisfaction of straight stacks and clean edges. He was not the talker in the place. He stood at the cutter and listened for the head to settle and the feeder to click. He went home after late shifts with the smell of cut paper in his clothes. It felt like a small comfort to bring a bit of the shop home with him. The first time he heard the crying, he had 2 sacks from the corner store in one hand and his key in the other. The motion light on his landing had woken with a thin click. He was not drunk, but he had the loose warmth of 2 cheap beers taken quick at the store while his sandwiches ran through the press. The cry slid up from below like a string pulled through sinew. He had paused with the key halfway to the lock. Baby, he thought, and the word lodged. The cry kept coming, ragged and impatient. Then somehow it had more air in it and rose higher, and it sounded urgent in that particular way that throws a hook into the chest and drags. He'd gone down 1 flight. The concrete smelled damp, but that was not unusual. The lights on that landing were off. He told himself the breaker had tripped, or the sensor had gone crusty from dust. The crying grew, then stopped, like a hand snapped over a mouth. He froze and felt that little prickling along his neck and scalp that the old folks called a weather change. The quiet felt heavy, like when snow is about to fall. He did not believe in much, but he believed in the way silence could fill a stairwell and change its shape. Then the light above snapped off behind him and the darkness pressed at his back. He did not move. He waited for his eyes to climb toward useful shades. He heard no doors. He heard no breathing. He kept the sacks hugged in to keep the cans from showing their small rattles. He stood there long enough for a chill to get into his fingers. He listened and felt as though the quiet was an animal that had gotten into the building and crouched a few steps below, testing its patience against his. Eventually he eased backward, 1 step and then another, testing for the edge of the next riser. He did not like to turn his back in that kind of dark. When the higher sensor woke and the light clicked over him, relief came in a quick wash that he did not want to name. He climbed and went into his apartment. He set the sacks on the counter and listened for the elevator or some neighbor's door. The building hummed with its usual small systems. The fridge made a breathy burr. The hallway vent sent a dull murmur as though a sea lay somewhere beyond the drywall. No more crying. He told himself it had been a television set or a phone video. People stayed up late with shows that had to make their noise. He made a small dinner and ate at the sink. He stood there and watched the kitchen window cloud over from his own breath. He did not turn on music. He slept with the noise machine turned low, a wash of static in the corner. In the morning, the stairwell smelled of mopped water and a chemical lemon that almost made his eyes water. Someone had cleaned. The wedges of sunlight through the wired windows drew bright bars across the steps. He checked the small board by the mail slots where the landlord tucked announcements. A sheet of paper listed a pest company coming in a few days, and below that, another page about how the elevator was awaiting a part. There was nothing about a child or a noise complaint or anything that would make him feel better or worse for having heard what he had. He went to work. Days went like that for a while. He heard no more crying. He told himself the night had stretched his hearing and made him pick up sounds that belonged to elsewhere. He made orders at the shop, fed bright reams, cleared paper jams, set the stack jogger to tame the edges. He took the river road home. He tried to time his walk from the corner store to catch the stairwell when even the stubborn light would wake. He kept a small plate by his sink to collect the coins that came back in change. It held a slow circle of nicked quarters and dull dimes, and a few bent pennies he liked to keep around. He was not a superstitious man, not beyond the small rituals everyone carried, but there were moments when he touched the coins without meaning to. It was a way to steady his mind. On a damp night after a rain, he heard the cry again. Same slither up the shaft, same pull. It came from below, but he could not fix the number of floors in his head, not in that moment. He paused on the landing. He expected the shutoff this time, and when the light behind him clicked, he did not start. The cry rose, saw-toothed and choking, like a cough caught in it. He thought about calling down, a simple hey, but the word did not rise. It snagged. He took the steps down in slow ticks, one, then the next, holding his palm along the guardrail where the paint had bubbled. On the next landing, the sound felt closer, fuller, but then it softened, then went away again. There was no door ajar, no stroller, no plastic bag of diapers or scattered toys, or the ordinary debris that announces a family. He stood and listened, and the quiet pressed on his ears the way a hand might. He became aware of the building in a deeper way, the water lines humming the soft tick and drip of something cooling in a pipe, the low sigh of a dryer in a unit on the other side of a wall. He thought he could pin the origin of each sound, and because he could, he told himself he was fine. When he got back to his own door, the hallway motion light stayed stubbornly dark, but the one in his entryway woke right up the moment he touched his keys to the lock. He said the word baby out loud in the dark as a test. The sound of his own voice in the hallway made the hair on his arms rise. He let himself in and shut the door and set both locks. He lay down later and found his sleep light and edgy. He drifted and woke to small noises that turned out to be nothing. He dreamed a face pressed to glass, but when he woke with a start, he could not say whose face, only that it had been close and colorless. He got up and drank water and listened to the radiator tick. The night went on long past when he was used to its going on. At the print shop, he miscut a stack for the first time in years. He stood there with the ruined copies and heard the cutter head humming up, and the sound seemed to shiver all along the blade. He measured, reset, cut again, found the line true. He told his boss he had not slept and left it there. The man shrugged and said to take a break and get some air. He went out back where the dumpsters leaned. The air smelled of the river and of wet cardboard. He stood in shade that held on even while the rest of the block brightened. He felt watched in a dull, harmless way, the way a sparrow will sit on a fence and cock its head. He told himself he had spooked himself with the stairwell, and that slowly, without noticing, he was letting the building pen him in tighter than any place ought to pen a person. On a late afternoon, coming up from the mailboxes with a handful of pizza coupons and a small padded envelope he had forgotten he de-ordered, he noticed a fresh note pinned to the board. It said that someone had left food trash in the hall near the utility closet. It asked that everyone please use the bins. It was signed with a name he had seen on older notices, but never on a rent check. The name looked like a good person trying to be patient. There was a number to call in case of leaks. He stood there and looked at that number, though he had no leak. He thought about calling it and saying what he had been hearing, and he thought about how that would sound said out loud. He made food. He ate standing at the counter again. Later, he took a load of laundry down to the basement, which was not much of a room. The light buzzed and held steady. The machines did their usual steady thrum. He leaned back against the cinder block wall and watched the small rivulets in the window glass as the cycle spun. There was a smell here that was part soap, part damp wool, part earth from the shale lot. The nearest machine had a ding on its top, where someone had dropped a wrench or a hammer. He looked at his own reflection in the chrome of the coin box, warped and long. For a second it made him think of a figure stretched out on a slab, not dead but not fully present either, and that startled him in a small way that he almost laughed at. When he brought the basket back up, the motion light at the first landing went off and on, like someone was testing the time. He paused and watched it. The cadence was nearly regular, a slow blink that made the wall shadows breathe. He listened for the other reason to pause, a cry or even a human voice, but there was nothing but the steady breath of the building. He held still long enough that the light decided he was not worth tracking and went out again. He moved on. He did not think about the blinking too hard. He folded shirts later and paired socks and felt steadier. Night came again to the shale block the way it always came, slow and a little later than it should, because of the low hills. He was in his chair by the window, with the noise machine running something that sounded like a far radio. The apartment smelled like laundry and pasta and raw gypsum from the wall, where he had patched a small hole the previous winter. He did not turn the television on. He had been turning it on less lately. He found its sound jangly in a way that scattered him rather than settled him. He watched the parking lot instead. He watched the way the lights threw their cones down and held off the dark around the edges, but never could quite shove it away. The cry woke him not as a sound, but as a memory of a sound. He came alert and sat with his breath held and felt the memory shift into the actual thing. He got up before thinking much about it. He opened his door and stood in the hall and looked down to the well of the stair. The motion light at his end was on. The lower ones were dark. The cry came again, dry at the edges like someone had run it through sand, and he could not say if it was closer or if the built echo had changed. He started down. The iron rail was cold under his hand. He took each step and felt the rise of caution in him, like someone slowly lifting a lid on a pot they were not sure about. He found the landing where the cry had felt closest the first time, and he stood. The sound arrived and went thin, moved, doubled on itself, paused, coughed. He turned his head toward the utility closet without meaning to. The door stood shut with its little vented panel dull with lint. He stood there long enough to tease out the sound of the compressor on the other side, the start and stop of it, the small sigh it made as pressure shifted. The cry came again and ran through his ribs. He reached for the handle before he had allowed himself to have the idea. The door stuck the way it always did. He tugged. The light inside woke bright and unkind. The small room held the water heater and the Building S breathing machines and a tower of paper towels on a shelf and a dusty push broom with half its bristles bent. He looked down at the floor. There was a pair of small scuffs near the corner, 2 grey arcs as though someone had set down a heavy grocery bag. He crouched to look, then felt foolish for crouching. He stood again. The small cry rose again, and was not in this room. It was below. He shut the door. A wet thought moved through him that if he kept opening doors he would find something eventually. This thought felt like a hand on his back. He did not like it. He went one more flight down. The lowest light did not wake. The hallway down there was stranger, nearer to the ground, a little colder. Someone had taped a strip of cardboard over the crack at the bottom of the exterior door to keep out insects, and the tape had given up on one end. There was a bit of leaf stuck in the sticky edge, pressed flat and dry as thin skin. He stood there and let his eyes adjust and tried to feel foolish enough to go back upstairs. He heard then another thing besides the cry. It came very softly from beyond the exit door, from the slab out back where the dumpsters sat. It sounded like wheels. He thought of a stroller and immediately felt ridiculous for thinking it. He stood a moment more and then slid the push bar. The door made that small grunt that all such doors make. Damp air came in, and the smell of the shale lot, and the smell of trash, not yet rank. The outside light threw a chalky triangle down. The little sound of wheels came again, brief, like someone tested a cart and then stilled it. He took a slow step onto the slab. There was the fence and the cracked pavement and the dumpsters with their lids heavy as tomb slabs. He waited to see a person step into the light and apologize or explain or even yell at him for coming out. But no one did. The cry came again from inside the stairwell, as though the sound had somehow slipped past him while he stood with the door held open. This bothered him. He moved back in and let the door hush shut behind him. For a second the wind caught the cardboard on the crack and made it flutter like a little hand. It went on like that for some days, or what felt like a string of days. He would hear the crying at odd hours, not every night, not in a pattern he could hang anything on. He would go down a flight, then sometimes two, and stand and listen, and the sound would move away. He would look at doors and tell himself the sound must be from behind one, and he would wait for a knob to turn, and none would. The noise felt not like a call, but like what happens when a room holds some notes longer than others. He began to think that the building, in some new mood, was holding a particular sound, the way he sometimes held a coin in his palm. Work did not stop because of this private struggle. He cut and boxed and sorted. He noticed his appetite being off a shade here and there. He put food down and then rewrapped it and put it away. He found himself standing at the press, with the thought of the stairwell resting in his mouth like a dull coin. He was never a big talker with the others, but now he held even further back. He felt a small fear that if he spoke about it, the thing would have to become real enough to prove. He did not want to be tested. He wanted to be believed, and lacking that, he wanted at least to be left alone with it. An advisory went out in the neighborhood about water pressure. The city put up a bulletin saying crews were working on a line under the river road and that there could be interruptions. The landlord copied the notice and taped it to the board with the same kind of tape he used for everything. The printed words made all of it feel normal. He looked at that tape edge while he waited for the mail. The adhesive had darkened where fingers had pressed it. He spent a long time looking at that without meaning to. The world had gotten smaller in a way that even he could not pretend not to notice. On a morning of thin sun, he found a pacifier in the stairwell on the second landing from the top. It lay near the wall, dusty, the little ring dull. He bent and picked it up and held it like an artifact. It was not new. It had the chalk of years on it. The rubber had gone cloudy. He wiped it with his thumb and felt a little ridicule rise at himself for wiping it. He could picture a box of such things in the utility closet, left by a previous tenant who could not be troubled to move one more box. He could picture the landlord sweeping up and missing this one small object. He turned it in his hand. For a moment, he was certain he had seen it somewhere else, in some other building where he had lived before, or in a thrift store bin, or in a small drawer at the print shop where people left things that did not belong. The feeling was false memory, but that did not make it feel less pointed. He carried the pacifier to the board and set it on the little shelf under the mail slots, where people left found keys and other small detritus. He placed it so the ring hung off the edge, as if that made it easier for the owner to see. He had the thought, very simple and clean, that this was a mistake, and that thought made his chest feel hollow for a second, the way a quick drop in an elevator will. He left it there. He went to his apartment. He shut the door, and the small click of the latch sounded momentous in a dumb way. That night, there was no crying. He waited without meaning to wait. He held his breath at every small shift in the building's tone. He got up and walked the rooms of his place, which did not take long. He opened the freezer and looked at the cold light and shut it again without taking anything. He put a glass under the tap and held his fingers in the water to test its pressure as if he were a utility man. It was fine. It was normal. He drank and stood with the glass in his hand and watched the way the fridge seal took the door back in with a patient whisper. He slept and dreamed he was in the stairwell again, but it was bigger, and the steps curved, and there were windows at every landing, and the light outside was the grey light before a storm. In the dream, he knew there was a baby and that it was behind a door. But there were too many doors, and they all had numbers that kept shifting like rain on a windshield. He woke with the figure of a door number in his head and watched it slide away. After that, he lay awake and counted his breaths and then stopped counting because numbers were starting to make him feel a little sick. Morning, and the pacifier was gone from the little shelf. The shelf held only a lonely key with a red tag and a torn corner of a flyer for a yard sale that had already come and gone. He stood and looked at the empty place where he had set the pacifier and felt both foolish and vindicated in some grey way that did not comfort him. The printer at the shop started to make a faint squeal. He ran the test sheets and called the serviceman, whose card was taped to the wall by the light switch. The serviceman came in a crisp jacket with a logo over the breast and moved the cover and peered into the guts and spoke in a careful way about bearings and belt tension. The squeal went away. The man left. The sound returned later, a little fainter, but with a new flutter at the end. He told himself machines were like people, easily unbalanced and always on the edge of finding new music in their faults. Late that week, the stairwell lights developed a new habit. The top two would wake together, a small mercy he appreciated. The middle one would lag, and then the lower ones would wake and die, as if something small kept darting in and out of their sight. He told himself this could be a moth, or a bird, or even the remains of some tape over a sensor. He resisted the old thought of something else. He had never been a man who saw shapes in things. He did not want to begin. He began to plan his trips. He would take the trash down when there was daylight on the slab. He would carry his laundry down when he knew the machine next to his floor might be in use, when there would be another person likely to pass. He caught himself timing his life in the interest of being under certain lights at certain moments, and when he saw that, he felt ashamed in a way that was more anger than shame. He walked one night on purpose in the dark, down the stairwell, without pausing. He held the rail hard and counted his breaths in his head, not with numbers, but with the rhythm of the press in the shop, the way it chuffed and then set, chuffed and then set. The door at the bottom opened easily, as it always had. He went out and sat on the edge of the slab with his hands on his knees. He could see across to the shale lot. There were small fires sometimes on the far side where people burned brush. There were not now. The sky pulled low. A truck passed on the road and made the fence rattle in a way he had always liked. He sat there and told himself that the sound of crying was not coming for him. It was in the building because buildings hold things. He breathed until the air felt like air and not a thing that had to be managed. A few minutes before he stood, he realized the noise machine in his apartment upstairs would be playing to an empty room, and the thought made him a little sad. The next time the crying came, it did not wash up from below. It woke behind him in the hall beyond his own door, down where the hall turned to the stairwell, thin and ugly and real enough to make his scalp pull tight. He opened his door with the lock still turned. He did not think about that. He stood in the small opening and listened. It came again, faint and then a bit fuller, as if something had turned its face. He said hello out of habit, out of the desire to make an ordinary bridge. He stepped out, but kept his hand on his knob. He took 2 steps toward the hall turn and stopped. The motion light above him woke. The one beyond the turn stayed dead. The cry came once more, wavered, ended on a short breath. He stood. He did not move toward the corner. He stayed where he was, thinking of a line on a shop floor that you do not cross without another set of hands. He waited there long enough that his calves began to hum. When finally he made himself take a step, the light above him went out, and the one at the far end woke and his eyes tried to shift in two directions at once, and he had to put his palm to the wall to steady himself. He stood like that, a man braced against painted cinder block, until the light bickered itself back into a reasonable arrangement. He slept badly. He dreamed of a coin rolling on edge and then lying flat, and the silence that comes after a coin falls. He woke with a weird thirst. He drank too much water and had to get up again in the dark. The fridge made a new click that felt like a throat clearing. The landlord slid a new notice under his door the next day. It was a typed letter about some rewiring to be done the following week, with warnings about short outages and the request that everyone stay out of hallways during certain hours. It thanked everyone for patience. The letter had that same name at the bottom, the same careful tone that wanted to be kind and authoritative all at once. He read it twice, not because the content mattered, but because the measured language felt like a blanket thrown over something. He liked it for that. At the shop, he fixed some small thing for a woman who taught at the elementary school and was late and tired and trying to look like both of those facts were temporary. He put her job ahead of the others without saying he was doing so. She thanked him and called him a lifesaver in a way that did not feel like a joke to her. He thought of telling her about the crying and about how tired he felt, but he did not. He thought of the line where talk becomes burden. He took the long way home through the smaller streets. He noticed the particular hollowness of the late afternoon when people have not yet come home, but the buildings have stopped pretending to be anything but boxes of echo. He got to his building and did not go in. He walked past and around to the lot and looked up at the stairwell windows. There was nothing to see. The glass was old and wavy. The light behind it made the windows look like dark water. He told himself that if he stood here long enough, he might see a light go on or off and know a person was moving in there, and that this would cure him of something. He did not stand long enough. He went inside. After the rewiring notice went up, the stairwell lights behaved worse. Two would pop and then shudder back to dim, then overcorrect and go harsh and then slide down to nothing as if bored. There were hours where the whole spine of the building seemed to breathe on a different schedule. He noticed his own breath coming out of time with it. He found himself waiting on the landings, trying to let the building's rhythm take him and then make it spit him back out. One late night he carried a bag of trash down and met the neighbor from the floor below, the one with the little dog that never barked. They had nodded in passing for months without speaking. The man had eyes that always seemed wet from smoke or wind. They stood in the narrow run by the chute and made remarks about the rewiring and the city crews and the way the lights were going to give someone a seizure. They stood closer than he liked. The other man smelled like bar soap and damp clothes. He was the one who brought up crying. He said he had been hearing it at odd hours and had told himself it was a television until he stood close to a wall and realized the sound was inside the wall. Then he laughed, a short sound. He said he was too old to be scared by anything a wall did. And then he rubbed his eyes and asked for a light like in the old days when people smoked. He did not have a light. They parted. He climbed back up and felt a strange relief that the sound was not his alone. This relief soon curdled into a new worry, a sense that the sound would not be satisfied until he was alone with it again. The landlord held the rewiring to promised hours. Men came in with tool belts and quiet competence. The building had a different smell those days, warm dust and rubber, and the clean fragrance of fresh plastic on wire. The men nodded and spoke in simple sentences. They were good at taking a place apart without making it feel any worse than it had already felt. He stayed out of the way. He walked around his own rooms as if he were a guest in a small rental, careful not to put hands on certain surfaces. In the hall, one man balanced on a ladder and said the sensors on the stair lights were finicky things and that a short could make them think someone was always coming or never coming. He thanked the man and said nothing else. The man's shoulders were as wide as the doorframe. The man looked like the world made sense to him, as long as the lines fed the right way. During that work, the crying stopped. The stairwell turned into the usual empty drum that held the building's shared noises, but no others. The quiet shifted from threat to a kind of blessed reprieve. He found himself listening greedily to find a nothing where there had been something. He slept a little better. He ate better. Food tasted more like itself. The world looked like it had put one small thing in order. On the first night after the men finished and wrote their last note on the board, the crying returned, not loud, but unashamed, and it came from his own floor. He sat at his table with his bowl and spoon and thought at first that the sound had risen from his memory again. That doubt lasted only a moment. The noise was ordinary in its shape. A baby calling and running out of breath. A baby starting again to make the call stick. He stood and went to the door and put his eye to the peephole. He saw the soft bend of the hall. He opened the door and stood with one foot over the threshold. He made himself knock on the door to his left. He had never knocked on that door. A woman in a sweatshirt and loose pants opened it a crack. She looked wary. She said hello in a voice that said she would close the door if he sounded wrong. He said he was hearing a baby crying and wanted to check if she heard it too. She tipped her head and listened, then shook her head and said no. She thanked him for asking. She started to close the door, then stopped and said she had a set of earplugs she wore for night shifts. So maybe she had not heard anything in months and would not be the judge of it. She said goodnight and closed the door in a way that made it obvious she had not been rude. He stood for a moment and knocked on the door to his right. No answer. He stood there a little longer than needed, then went down one flight and did not knock because the sound was above him now, and because he did not want to make a fool of himself going door to door in a building where people like to be left alone. He returned to his apartment and sat with his bowl and watched the spoon slide in the leftover milk. He could still hear the crying. It no longer climbed or receded. It stayed at a steady, thin insistence, like a kettle just below boil. He set the spoon down. He walked to his bedroom and opened the closet, and stood there looking at his shirts. He had the thought that if he had a baby monitor, the kind his sister had used in the old apartment by the mill road, he could use it to triangulate the sound. The thought was foolish and immediately felt less foolish. He did not have such a monitor. The lack of it felt like a failure, which made no sense. He put his shoes on and checked his pockets and left his apartment. He walked down the stairs and out to the street and took the corner to the little shop that sold everything and nothing. The air smelled like someone had burned coffee in a way he liked. The fluorescent lights hummed. The aisles had a logic that never quite took. He found, back beyond batteries and chargers, a little row of baby gear, a small plastic monitor in a box with a glossy picture. He carried it to the counter. The man at the register gave a small nod that said no judgment, no curiosity, just another sale. He took it and his receipt and walked back. The crying had followed him in its way, living now behind his ear, thin and constant. He unboxed the thing at his table. The instructions were useless in the way all such instructions were useless, and he did not want to plug anything into anything. He had bought a model that worked on batteries. He set the little unit down on the table, a round speaker with a grilled face that made him think of old cars. He clicked the small dial. Static opened like a wind from the sea. He turned the dial until the static shifted and separated, and he heard old radio ghosts, music from somewhere, then house noise like what he lived in without hearing. He walked it to the door. The crying was still there. He stepped out and turned the dial a hair, and then another hair, until the line of the sound sharpened. The monitor picked up a thin wail with less room around it. The hair on his forearm stood. He stood in the hall with the little speaker held out in front of him like a divining rod. He did not mean to do that. It made him feel like a fool. He walked toward the corner where the hall bent to the stairwell. The monitor fed him a version of the cry that was a little louder now, a little more certain. He reached the bend and took the angle, and the monitor's sound fell a notch, as if he had moved past the heart of it and toward its reflection. He rose and tilted the little unit up toward the ceiling. The wail came steady in his ear. He turned the dial back the smallest fraction, and the sound sharpened again, thin as a thread under tension. He stood under the light and thought that maybe he had made a simple headphone for the building. He saw the absurdity of it and did not mind. He took 2 steps back toward his apartment and felt the sound rise again in that quiet machine. He took another step and felt it peak, and he stopped there. The wall to his right was a stretch of smooth paint, broken by the square outline of a panel box and a small metal plate with 2 screws. He put his spare hand on the wall and held it there. He felt nothing but the low vibration that lived inside all walls. He set the monitor on the floor and put his ear to the wall like a boy. He closed his eyes. The crying came separate in the monitor and close in the plaster, and for a second his head swam with the 2. He felt a tear tickle down his temple. He did not pull away. He held himself there and listened because it felt forced upon him. The crying did not stop. It did not change. It did not maddeningly fade. It went on with a stout insistence that was more terrible than any variation would have been. It was a machine set to a single task. He pulled away and found himself breathing hard and quiet. He picked up the little unit and turned its dial to kill the sound. He stood in the hall with that little plastic mouth shut, and the living sound still reaching him with no medium between them at all. And he did not like the way this made him feel like a participant. He went back inside and sat with the unit in his lap. He felt foolish to have bought it and foolish to put it away. He set it on the counter. He washed his bowl with too much attention. He dried it and set it upside down. The crying went on. He turned the noise machine up, then off, then on again, as if he could recalibrate his own space. He thought about calling the number on the board. He did not call. He thought about knocking again on doors. He did not knock. He walked to the shop and set the cutters and the feeders, and found himself moving like a person trying to line up a printer head by ear. He made fewer mistakes this way, which disgusted him a little. He did not want to benefit. It was typed like the others and asked that everyone please keep the hallways clear because a city inspector would be walking the building before the end of the week. It asked for a clear path to all closets. It sounded cheerful in a tired way. He stood and read it once and did not read it twice. He took the stairs up with a feeling in his chest like a crumpled receipt that would not lay flat. That evening he listened to the crying turn into a bass line. He cooked and ate. He showered and toweled himself and laid the towel on the radiator like a man who has an exact routine. He sat, and the room had the warm smell of wet cotton drying. He thought about the empty drawer in his dresser where he kept nothing, as if it was saving a place for something. He thought about the basements in every place he had ever lived. He thought about his sister's baby, now old enough to ride a bus and hate it. He went to the hall again with the monitor because he could not think of anything else to do. He turned the dial until the thin sound found him. Then he walked slowly toward the stairwell and then back again, like a man trying to find a hidden stream. The little speaker steadied again at the same place in the wall by the panel and plate. He had the thought that the sound was in the wall, the way a trick draft can live inside a house without giving itself away as wind. He stared at the metal plate. He looked for a screw head he could turn. He fetched a screwdriver. He set the monitor on the floor and tested each screw. They were tight enough to resist the first firm twist. He put his ear to the metal as if a blood beat would come through. The crying went on, a little louder for having fixed his attention here. He worked at the plate until one screw gave with a dry chirp, then the other hemmed and then came. He lifted the plate. Behind it was a junction box with capped wires and a dust of drywall. It was clean in the way spaces behind plates are clean, cobweb fine and undisturbed. He leaned close. The crying kept its distance and its shape. He put the plate back and turned the screws by hand and then with the driver until they snugged up. He did not over-tighten, though he wanted to. He slept that night with the monitor in the kitchen like a small radio he had forgotten to turn off. He woke at odd hours. He stood and watched the weak light bleed at the edges of his blinds. He lowered the blinds further and made a joke in his head about the building needing its own set of blinds. The inspector came 2 days later in the late morning. He wore a jacket with a seal and carried a tablet with a cracked corner. He walked around the building with the landlord, who held keys like a rosary. The two of them had a tired gait in common. He crossed the inspector in the stairwell on his way down. The inspector asked about the lights, and he said they had always been like that, which felt like a betrayal of their recent history, but also felt true in a way that made him uneasy. The inspector nodded and moved on. The landlord looked like he wanted to ask him something and did not ask. He went on to work. The crying fading in daylight did nothing for him now. It was as if his mind had grown small rooms where the sound lived always. That night, the power fluttered. Not out, not gone. A short lift and drop. The fridge sighed and rallied. The noise machine caught itself. The motion light in the hall beyond his door woke and then slept and then woke, exhausted by its inconsistent task. The crying did not falter. He sat at his table and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands until sparks danced there. He told himself again to call the number on the board. He went to the board and stood and looked at the number for the length of a held breath, and then several, and then he took his phone out and called. The letter voice picked up. It belonged to a person with a patient rhythm and the careful diction of someone who had put up many notices and swallowed many petty complaints. He said his name and said his apartment and said he had been hearing a baby crying in the stairwell and he thought maybe it was trapped somewhere. Saying those words out loud turned them into teeth. He regretted the call, then did not. The voice asked him to repeat the part about where in the stairwell. He described the wall near the panel. The voice said the inspector had just signed off on that section and had not noted anything about sound complaints. He said he understood and asked if the landlord would be able to check the utility spaces. And the voice said they would, and he thanked the voice and hung up. After the call, he felt both worse and better in that way of calls to authority, which give back courtesy and planned responses, but cannot hold the thing you are trying to hand over. He sat again at his table. The crying continued. He thought of holding the phone to the wall to make the sound travel through a wire to a person with a seal on a jacket. The idea was ridiculous and strong. He rose and put the phone to the wall and pressed call and listened to the line ring. He hung up before the voice came back. He stood with the phone in his hand and laughed once, a single bark that startled him. He slept in his chair and woke with his neck sore and the window shining grey. The building made the small heat sounds it made in that hour. He put water on for coffee and forgot to make the coffee. He held the kettle over the sink and watched the steam find the coal patch on the window. The crying had not followed him here in the early light, or rather it had receded to its hidden room. That absence was worse now, because it held the promise of its inevitable return. He took the stairs down to the basement and checked the utility door as if it would be unlocked in a way it had never been. It was locked. He went to the washing machines, which sat quiet and ready. He ran his hand along the top of the nearest one, over the little dimple where a tool had once fallen. He left his hand there for a moment. The metal held the rooms cool. He climbed back up and paused on the landing where the wall plate was. The screws sheened, satisfying and flush. He stood and listened, and heard only the building's breath. He went inside and shut the door, and set the locks, and sat down and wrote a note on a scrap of paper and then tore it up, and the sight of the torn paper made him think of all the small scraps that creep under baseboards and live there for years. Late that evening, as the wind picked up in a way that made the building feel like a ship, he heard a new sound with the crying. It was small and ordinary, a creak, a footstep, or the memory of one. He told himself it was the wind making a hinge work in a door far away, and he almost convinced himself, but the next creak came closer, and he heard the whisper of someone's pant leg against painted cinder block, and he stood without knowing he had stood. He opened his door. The hall smelled faintly of something like baby powder and old dust, a chalky note that made his mouth feel dry. He felt lightheaded and calm, both at once. He stepped into the hall and closed his door behind him, and he did not lock it. The light above his door woke. It threw a sharp slice across the near wall and left the turn in a soft grey. He took a step toward the wall with the plate. The crying wavered and then reasserted itself. The new sound went silent. He took another step and stood with his shoulder near the panel. His ear told him the crying lived in the wall and behind it, and then also in the space of the hall beyond, the way a smell can inhabit both a room and a shirt that has hung there. He put his palm flat against the paint. The wall felt cool, then warmed under his hand. He held it there, waiting for the moment when that warmth crossed from something he was causing to something being caused to him. He did not feel that moment arrive. He thought maybe the wall had a slow pulse, or maybe he did. He stood there until his arm ached. He drew his hand back. The light above him died, and the one closer to the stairwell woke, and he stood in the mild dim it left behind. He picked up the little monitor from where he had set it on the floor earlier and clicked its dial. It found the sound like a hog finds a truffle. He took a slow step toward the stairwell, and the sound in the monitor dipped, and he took a step back and it swelled. And he felt that now familiar tightness in his chest that was not fear exactly, but the body's way of asking why he needed to know. He reached out and tapped the plate with the tip of the screwdriver until he heard the small ringing in the metal and then in the wall. He watched the screws like a man watches fish rise in shallow water. When nothing moved, he crouched on his heels and stared at the baseboard, at the thin line where paint met floor. Something dark lay in the crease. He leaned closer. It was a strand of hair, very fine, caught in paint and curling up where the brush had left it years ago. He blew on it and watched it move and then settle. Then his eyes pricked in that stupid way eyes will do at the smallest, loneliest things. He set the little monitor on the floor again and turned it low. The crying came out of it like breath through cheesecloth. He turned and went into his apartment and left the door standing open. He got his flashlight from the drawer where he kept tools, not because the light was off, but because he wanted to feel ready. He stepped back to the wall and pointed the light along the baseboard. The shallow shine found scuffs and tiny chips and the dull glint of the plate. He moved the beam slowly. He passed it over a spot where the paint seemed a shade different, paler, as if a patch had been made long ago and sanded and painted and then stained by air and hands. He stopped there and held the light. He pressed his thumb against the patch and the paint gave very slightly and then held. The sense came to him that a seam lay under the paint, not a door so much as a panel, once meant to be opened and then never opened again. He drew the light back and turned it off. He stood with his eyes closed and felt himself sway with the building. The crying went on, steady and thin. He lifted the screwdriver and set it against the edge of the patch and applied a soft pressure. The paint flaked and whispered. He worked along the seam with care, as if he were opening a box with a gift and did not wish to tear the paper. He told himself he had no right to do this. He told himself he would stop. He did not stop. The first edge came away like a scab. He worked at it until a square the size of a dinner plate was free, and he set it aside. Behind it lay old wood, dry and close-grained, with a line where two boards met like a mouth stitched shut. He put the light in his teeth and used both hands to press at the edges. The wood did not move. He took the screwdriver and set it in the seam and worried at it until the tip bit and then slid. The seam widened a breath. He felt air move, very slight, a cool breath out of that old mouth. The crying grew a hair louder, as if the world had moved a tiny barrier no one had remembered to tally. He sat back on his heels and looked into the thin gap and saw nothing but dark. He did not stick his fingers in. He is not a fool, he told himself. He is a person in a hallway with a small hole in a wall and a crying sound that will not stop. He stood and wiped his hands on his pants. He picked up the square of paint and board like a shield and set it back loosely in place. He leaned against the wall to feel it against his shoulder blade. He stood like that until the light lost interest and went out and left him with the soft rectangle of luminance from his open door. He closed his door and set the locks and put his tools away carefully. He ran water hot and then cold and watched the steam turn back on itself. He placed the little monitor face down on the counter and clicked its dial to nothing, then turned it one notch back. The crying came through the countertop in a way that made him picture sound as nails. He turned it off again. He turned every light on in his apartment. He sat on the floor with his back against the oven door because the oven was a solid thing that did not change. He listened to the building moving and found he could pick out here and there the crying, the breath of it coming and going like a tide that was always there even when water drew back beyond sight. He made it to morning that way. He shaved with a hand that shook a little. He went to work and cut paper, and the friendly weight of the blade up and down steadied him. When he came home, the air in the hall felt heavy, like a shirt that needs washing. The wall looked clean, the plates snug, the paint square back in place in a way that betrayed him for having replaced it himself. He half expected to see fingerprints on the paint that were not his. He saw none. He stood a long time reading the blankness of the wall. That night the sound changed. Not much. Enough. It had always come in the register of a baby calling for a person, and now it came with in-between breaths that were longer and then shorter again, as if the voice had taken instruction. He stood in the hall with his face close to the seam and felt a small sucking of air that was not quite air. He did not touch the wall. He did not move the square. He was careful, as a person is careful beside a sleeping animal that does not belong to him. He thought, and the thought was as simple as truth comes, that the building had a baby somewhere inside it, and that he was the person who had been chosen to hear it, and that this was not because he was special, but because he was available. He thought he should go get the landlord and make a real report with signatures. He thought he should put his shoes on and walk to the firehouse and tell them a person was in a wall. He thought he should lie on the floor and put his ear to the seam and wait for instructions. He did none of those things. He stood and counted breaths, not with numbers, but with the slow click of the cutter. And when he had counted 100 cutters by that vague measure, he went inside and sat in his chair and did not sleep, because sleep had gone out of him for a while. The weather turned damp with the promise of rain that did not come. The building grew smells to go with the weather. People cooked soups, wet shoes dried by doors. The hall took on a wet wool smell that made his teeth ache a little. He took a cup of coffee into the stairwell and sat on the top step in the early morning and watched the light come into the wired glass. He could hear the crying, but he could also hear the cleaner noises of a day starting up. A radio, a kettle, a neighbor's brief song. The combination made the crying seem ordinary, and this was worse than any other feeling he had about it. He went to work. He came home. He stood in the hall. He listened. He opened the small platform of paint again in the quiet hour before midnight. He widened the seam the smallest amount, enough to slip the edge of the beam in. He looked into a little space that was nothing but a hollow in the wall, old wood and dust and the long grey of a dead spider. He saw no wire that should not be there, no pipe that would echo, no clever machine, no sign of a joke. He smelled old wood and a faint sweetness that made him think of talc and then made him angry for thinking of talc. He lowered the light and stared until the shapes inside the hollow swam and then pulled back into dull blank. He could have put his hand in there. He did not. He sat with his back to the opposite wall and waited for the light to die again. He replaced the square and pressed it with his palm until it sat like it had always sat. He picked up a flake of paint from the floor and held it in his palm. It weighed less than nothing. He folded it into his pocket like a note. He slept and woke, and the days turned in their way. He started to forget small things. A spoon left in the sink, a light left burning, a shirt left on a chair back. He began to talk to himself in short phrases, little instructions and confirmations, as if his brain had split into a caller and an answerer. He caught this habit and tried to stop. He could not entirely stop. In the shop, he started to ask the machines, please. The machines did not care. They did what they did. He envied them for a few hours each day. The landlord's number burned in the little square on the board. He walked past it and did not call, not again. Then one evening, as a storm crawled up from the river with its low rumble and electric drag, he used his phone like a light and took a picture of the wall, a casual shot that could have been a note to a friend about a funny paint blemish. He looked at the picture in his hand and saw nothing but paint and plate and shadow. He raised the phone again to take a picture inside the seam. He set the light full and lowered the lens and tapped the little circle, and the phone made its quiet shutter sound that always felt like a lie. He raised the phone and stared at the image. The picture showed only the hollow, the seam, a bit of old paper stuck to wood. He zoomed. The old paper had a printed bit on it, a corner of an instruction sheet from a long-ago product. He could not make it out. He stared until his eyes watered. He put the phone down and felt relieved and disappointed all at once. He set the monitor against the baseboard and turned it on, and then off again. The crying went on. The storm made the building S-bones creak in a way that the crying tucked itself into, and then pulled out of cleanly each time, as if the sound had no interest in weather. He went to bed around the time he usually did, with the calm, deliberate steps of a man who can place one foot in front of the other, even when muddy water has started to swirl around his ankles. He lay on his side and looked at the wall and pictured the hollow like a small mouth. He thought about how everything in a building is shared, even when you do not share your life with anyone else. He thought about the vent lines and the water lines and the chases where wires run, and how a sound can travel along them like a whisper carried down a hall of lockers. He slept for a handful of breaths and woke with a jolt that felt like being pushed. When he woke, the crying had stopped. Not paused, not receded, not taken on the polite hush it sometimes had in the morning. It had stopped in a way that made the empty space in his head show its true size. He stood and walked to the hall. The motion light woke slow. He went to the patch and saw that the square of paint sat as he had left it, except that someone had pressed it a fraction deeper at one corner. He put his thumb there and pressed back and felt it resist. He told himself the building had settled. He told himself that the storm had moved things, that the wood had swollen. He told himself all the things a person tells themselves when they are pressed to stay. He put his ear to the seam and listened, and heard nothing at first, except the air sound in his own head, the whistle of blood. He waited. The silence grew and changed shape as his mind tried to force a content into it. He turned away. He went back inside. He turned his noise machine on low and sat in his chair. He looked at his hands and did not recognize them for a moment, not because they were different, but because they looked so exactly like his. He fell into a sleep that came only because his mind had exhausted itself with trying to hear and trying not to hear. He slept like a person on a bus, chin down, breath shallow, dreaming nothing he could name. He woke to the first light of a weak morning and went out into the hall, because that is what he did now. He put his ear to the patch and heard something. It was not the crying. It was a new sound, small and crisp, like the tiny snick a latch makes when someone on the other side tests it with a fingertip and no more. He froze and let his breath drop deep so it would not make noise in his chest. The snick did not come again. He stood there until the light timed out and the dim settled. He stood there beyond that, in a small pocket of dark, his shoulder against the paint, the square of patchwork under his hand. He found himself whispering without words, not asking, not praying, just a soft stream of noise like a person might make at a skittish animal. He waited for the crying to return because he had shaped himself around it. He waited because routine is a kind of mercy even when it eats you. He waited, and when the sound did not come, he finally quietly, in the narrow beat between two breaths, slid his fingers into the seam and lifted the paint square out and set it by his foot. He lowered one hand into the narrow gap and felt old wood and grit and the dry edge of a nail, and then he felt nothing at all. He held his hand there, in the cool breath of the building, waiting for the thing that had been waiting for him all along. His fingertips found only splinters and a fine grit like ground shell. He held still in the cool of that hollow, long enough to know the difference between a draft and what breath feels like when it moves past your hand. The air was not coming from outdoors. It had no damp, no scent of rain or night. It was the air of inside places touched once and sealed, patient and dry. He leaned until his shoulder met the edge of the opening and listened with his skin. He told himself that if anything living were tucked in there, it would touch him. He told himself that if nothing touched him, he would put the square back and clean the scabs of paint with a damp cloth and go to bed. He held, and nothing touched him, and he did not replace the square, not yet. He withdrew his hand. There was a soft powder on his fingers. He rubbed it with his thumb. It left a pale mark on his pants like chalk from an old schoolroom. He breathed out. The panel of his own door stood a few steps away, lit by the kind rectangle of his kitchen light. He felt its pull. He stepped back into his apartment and set the small square of wall on the table as if it were a hot plate, and he needed to put it somewhere that could take the heat. He washed his hands too long and watched the old water lines in the ceiling where the upstairs neighbor had once overfilled a planter. The building made its steady, late noises. Somewhere, a compressor started up and settled into a small, fast thrum. It sounded like someone thinking. He shut the water off. The tap ran a last thin thread into the sink and then let go. When he returned to the hall, he brought with him a towel without knowing he had brought it. He did not know what he thought he was going to do with it. He stood with the towel folded over his forearm like a person ready to take a coat. He laughed once without humor at himself and put the towel on the floor by his ankle. He put his hand into the opening again, slowly, as if he were entering a cold pond. The air in there had warmed 1 lean degree. He felt it on the small hairs at the back of his hand. A sound rose then, not the full crying he had lived with, but a smaller version. A little run of breath that caught and went thin, and then tried again. He felt it more than heard it. The hairs along his wrist flattened. He kept his fingers spread and still. He wanted to pull his hand away and then did not. He closed his eyes. The little sound came again, softer, at the edge of nothing. He thought of systems and echoes and the way sheet metal sings when a building changes temperature, and he knew those thoughts were not helping him and were not meant to. He drew back and stood with both hands caught at his sides, as if waiting for a scolding. He slid the square back into its place. The tiny ruff of misalignment would show if anyone looked. He felt it like a rash under a shirt. He touched the screws in the plate and then did not touch them again. He carried the towel back inside and folded it small and set it on the radiator. He turned his noise machine to a long, slow sweep that sounded like air coming up through grass. He lay down without turning out lights and did not sleep for a while, then did and did not remember crossing. He dreamed, or he was in the seam between sleeping and not sleeping, where memory starts to rise and drink. In the dream there were hallways, the length of freight trains and bulbs, that woke without a switch when he passed them, and then thought better of it and went dark. He spoke in his head to an infant he could not see, saying the easy nonsense people use to coax a reaction, and the nonsense kept turning into statements like a man making notes. He woke with the taste of paper on his tongue, a dry pulp that made him thirsty. He sat up and stayed in that position, hunched slightly, hands flat on the sheet, as if braced against a slow slide. He went to work with the shell of a person who could get through a day by pushing steady on the same cart. The shop held him, and the smell of warmed ink and the dry clap of the cutter head and the lean slice of two paper edges parting made a place where his mind could stop its running. He made very straight lines. When anyone asked him anything, he answered with words that fit and were enough. He did not look at the clock. He took his break, leaning by the back door with his palm on the cinder block, to feel the tremble when trucks took the river bend too quick. That small tremble pleased him in a way he did not like to examine. It proved he was still touching a world that moved in ways he knew. The crying did not make a full return that day. It came at the edges of his hearing as he walked the hallway, a sound like memory clipped to his ear. He kept the square in place. He passed it and did not stop, on purpose. He sat in his kitchen and ate something with a steady spoon, and the spoon tasted of metal in a way that made him feel he needed to scrub it 2 more times. He washed it until his knuckle burned from the heat. He set it to drain. He stood very still and did not look at the wall. The landlord's number on the board stayed the same size it had always been. Messages appeared around it and went. Someone wrote their name next to a lost package notice and then crossed it out in the way that looks like anger, but is often just the shape of a pen not writing good. He ran his finger under the strip, where flies tucked, and found the grit of dust that never leaves a surface once a building has collected it for long enough. The board's tape corners had begun to curl. He pressed one smooth without thinking and felt it lift itself back again the second he took his hand away. Rain came through the night thinly, a beadwork patter that ticked on the wired glass. He lay awake and listened. With the crying gone and then not gone, and then back to the low strain he knew, he found he could hear the building in its full orchestra. The water lines banged just once and then were shy. A neighbor rolled from one side to the other. The elevator took a breath and then thought better of it. He would have told anyone who asked that such attention comforts a person, the manner of a boy who counts passing cars to know the world will keep passing. It did not comfort him now, not really. It fixed him in place like a pushpin. After a few days of this, he could not say what day it was. He could have used a calendar to tell him, but that was not the kind of knowing he wanted. He wanted the feeling of day that comes in a person's bones when they sleep right, and heat their food and talk half a conversation with another human sometime before the hour where dusk makes glass look like water. He wanted backing. He moved the square whenever his mind could not hold its one task. He widened the seam and then pressed it shut. He ran the flashlight along the hollow and told himself he could see a change he could not say aloud. He sniffed for the powder and talc sweetness and cursed himself when he caught it, the second-hand scent of store shelves, of the false clean we buy in little tubs. He would shut the square and rub his palm over the paint as if he could erase what his own hand had started. He told himself to do one kind thing that did not involve the wall. He walked to the store on the corner and bought a bag of oranges because they were bright and round and not paper. He set them on his counter and stood looking at them until he laughed at himself again. He peeled one and ate it over the sink so the juice could go somewhere that made sense to catch it. He drank the little gathered pool and felt for a moment like a person. That evening the crying returned to what it had been at the beginning. Thin, commanding, no shame at all about its demand. It came with the suddenness of a light popping on in a room you had already accepted as dim. He put his hands flat on the table. He tapped each finger in order without leaving marks. He went to the hall and stood by the square and did not move it. That was his great achievement that evening. He stood in his place and took the sound without taking an action. He breathed until his breath turned ragged and then quieted again. He did not speak. The neighbor with the small dog and wet eyes passed once with a week's groceries. He nodded. The man stopped as if to remark on the hall, then looked at the square with his wet eyes and at the screwdriver sitting against the baseboard, then at the monitor he still had not put away. The man opened his mouth to speak and shut it again. He shuffled on as if he had been halted by the thought that he had already surely said this thing to someone once, and that saying it again would change nothing and might change too much. The little dog never barked, not once. It looked up at him with eyes that were old and honest. He looked back and saw himself reflected in black. He went down to the utility room later and stood by the broom. The smell down there had moved towards soil. The strip of cardboard on the door had taken grime at the edge where it caught shoes. He lifted a corner, and it stayed lifted. He pressed it, and it stuck for a second, and then eased back up. He imagined the whole door covered in tape, thick and white, a seal against something that wanted in. He let the cardboard be. He stood and looked at the machines. He thought, not for the first time, of climbing into one and closing the lid and letting the spin throw him until he gave up on anything but round. He dreamed again about hallways. In this dream, the lights did not merely refuse, they watched. He could feel them tracking his heat, making choices. He woke and felt the imprint of a square on his cheek from the fold of the pillowcase. He laughed and then did not. He put on coffee without filling the kettle far because the advisory about water pressure had come back, and he had found that he started to feel guilty about taking more water than he needed. He poured the coffee wrong and slopped some. He wiped it with a dishcloth and went over the spot until the smell of coffee surrendered to the cloth, old detergent. In the shop, he cut a large run of menus for a place that changed its specials only in a schedule the owner believed he had invented. He liked that. The owner had given him a stack of notes scribbled in the margins that said things like, "Make the red darker and not too dark, and can a plate look saltier?" He did what he could. He saved the old plates in a milk crate by the table where he ate his sandwiches on the days he remembered to pack them. He ran his hand over the face of the paper and felt it lift into a shape he could trust his eyes and hands with. An afternoon came when the crying took on a shape it had not had before. It rose and fell in an almost pattern that lived on the edge of what a person might call words, if a person were lonely or wanted something to be talking back. He did not put words to it. He did, however, start answering under his breath. Little replies, nothing. A hum that matched the shape of the noise without reaching for its meaning. He worked until he had matched himself to it, the way a person whistles back to a bird to feel less foolish for whistling alone. At the board, another notice appeared. It said that certain carpets would be replaced and asked that furniture be pulled into the centers of rooms. It reminded everyone about the trash pickup schedule. It thanked everyone for their patience. He stared at the words and pictured the building rolled up like a rug. He had a moment where this seemed like a plan, as if the building were a fold of fabric he could lift and shake and clean and then lay flat. He knew what to do with cloth. He had folded and shaken and laid flat all his life. He put his fingers under the edge of the paper as if to test its weight. That night, sleep did not come. He had not done anything worse than stand and listen and move a square of paint around, but his chest felt the way it does after a long run in cold air, as if he had asked his own work to hurry for too long. He brewed tea and forgot it. He turned the faucet on and off and had to stop himself because he was beginning to hear a note in the metal when it cooled. Some remembered pitch that made his teeth itch. He sat on the floor with his spine braced. He slid the monitor across the linoleum with his foot, not turning it on, just feeling its small mass against his soul. Near the middle of the night, the crying went away and did not come back. He waited, and then, refusing to be called, he went to the hall anyway. He brought his flashlight because he wanted to. He took the square out of habit. He held it in his left hand. He set the light on the floor and let it shine into the hollow. He leaned and looked and saw what he had seen before. The close walls of a small chase, the faint lines like leaf veins where old sapwood had dried. His eyes wanted to make a shape there. His brain wanted to oblige. He sat on his heels until his legs went to pins. He reversed them and sat with his back to his own door. He put the square in his lap like a plate. He tried not to think about what the hollow reminded him of. He failed. He thought of mouth. The next day, someone slipped a note under his door. It was written in a hand that liked angles and had learned to write plans. It said that there had been reports of noise, that the stairwell was a shared space, that any alterations to walls would need to be approved. It was kind in its way. It wanted to set the world right with gentle words. It did not say his name. It made him feel both seen and not seen, both chastened and defended, which is a way of being a person in a building with others. He folded the note and set it 1 finger width under the sugar jar. He said aloud that he would leave the wall alone. The words felt good against his teeth. He made it most of a day before failing. He took the square down again in the dim hour before first light. He widened the seam and let the hollow breathe. He put his palm against the edge and felt a beat that might have been his own hand, a small engine working under skin, or might have been the building finally giving up an admission. He did not try to decide. He waited. A smell came then that he had not caught before. It was not talc this time. It was the raw milk smell of something kept in cloth. He had not smelled it since his sister's baby, in a room where a shirt had soured a little and then been rinsed and wrung and hung. The smell went through him with a piston's smoothness, up and down. He put his face close to the seam and then caught himself and pulled back, embarrassed by the image of himself nosing a wall. He went inside and washed his face with the towel he had set on the radiator nights ago. The towel had warmed beyond itself. It smelled faintly of iron, not blood, not rust, just the iron that comes out of old pipes and lives in fabric a while. He lay down and lifted the noise machine and turned its dial to a sound that called itself a lake. He thought about turning the machine off for good. He thought about throwing the monitor away. He thought about buying a roll of heavy plastic and taping it over the entire wall. He fell asleep in the middle of a thought about concrete. He slept until his alarm told him he was late, and then he made himself even later, standing in the hall with his head cocked, listening to nothing. At the shop, a man came to pick up a banner and talk to him about how in his childhood stairwells were the place the world thinned. How stairwells were places that made you a believer in small souls. The man laughed after saying it and made a gesture that cancelled the seriousness of his mouth. He made the gesture back and did not say, "Yes, thin, yes, believer." He carried the banner to the man's trunk and closed it with both hands so it made the comforting thunk of well-hung metal, and the man thanked him like he had kept something inside from spilling into the street. He went home by the smaller streets again. He stopped by the shale lot and looked up at his stairwell windows. The glass made its little waves. He pictured the hollows behind the paint, as if they were tucked under the glass like small, sleeping bodies. He stood there until a car came slow, and his presence in the lot made him feel like he owed someone an explanation. He went inside and held his mail up to the hall light. It was all flyers and one envelope with a typed name that was not his, and a return address far away that no longer belonged to the person on the envelope. He set it on the shelf by the mail slots. The pacifier had not reappeared. The key with the red tag was gone. He imagined someone turning it with relief in a lock after weeks of delay. He felt weirdly jealous of that straight-line success. He ate what he had and washed what he dirtied. He practiced walking past the square like a person with no square in his life. He made it back and forth 3 times. He turned on the 4th and lifted the square and set it down with a sort of temperate care that would make any courthouse clerk let him handle the old papers. He tilted the flashlight in and saw something that had not been there before. At least, he had not seen it. It lay in the bottom seam of the hollow, tucked where the board met the stool of the wall, a little wad of cotton, off-white, torn. It was the size of a coin. He breathed out and the cotton rose and then settled again, as if it had been waiting for that small trial. He stared. He wanted to believe that this was the simple shedding of the building, the way a place will slip bits of itself into its own cracks, just as a person drops hair that becomes dust under a bed. He knew with a sour steadiness that he did not believe that. He reached with the tip of his screwdriver and touched the cotton, and felt it give and then cling. He teased it toward the light. When he saw it fold over the screwdriver's flat head, he felt sick enough to sit back on his heels. He thought of a mouthful of gauze, not at the dentist, but in some story someone tells you too late at night. He did not remove it. He pushed it gently back into the dark and pressed it twice to make sure it stayed. He put the square up and rubbed the line with his palm. He went inside and set the screwdriver in the drawer, where it lived among rubber bands and a single nail and a few of those odd screws that seem never to fit anything. He stared at the drawer until the little shapes, band, nail, screw, looked like alphabet letters in an unfamiliar language. The landlord knocked an afternoon later with the inspector in tow. The little dog neighbor stood down the hall, watching in the manner of a man allowed a show but denied a ticket. The landlord was decent from what anyone could tell. He had the hoop-shouldered look of a man who could lift a water heater if he had to. The inspector smelled faintly of wool and sun. They asked about the plate and the seam. He kept his answers short and uncolored. He showed them that the panel could be moved and that he had moved it. He did not quite say why. The inspector went through his list and tapped the plate, then knelt and looked at the seam with the light of a small pen. He said words like settlement and thermal and void, and he meant them. The landlord nodded, as if each word slotted neatly into a rack he kept in his thinking. They looked kind in their way, because they were not hearing what he was hearing and did not wish, on balance, to make his life worse. They said that if something living were in there, pest or otherwise, they would address it. He did not put breath behind the word baby. He nodded. He apologized for the paint. He accepted responsibility with a small bow he hated himself for making. They left him with the instruction to leave the square in place. He said he would, and he meant it even as he knew he could not keep to it. The neighbor with the dog tipped his head to show he had no part in this. The dog blinked, grave. He went inside and stood with his forehead against the cool of his own door and laughed, soundless, at the bent patience in the world. The crying did not come that night. He took that as reward he had not earned, and as a threat he understood too well. He opened the square despite himself when the lights in the hall had decided the hour had rolled far enough past ordinary. The smell inside the hollow had changed. It held a sweetness that was not pleasant. He thought of fruit left in a closed room and then cut his own thought off and replaced the square hard enough to chip its edge. He pressed his thumb along the line until the push in his skin matched the press of the wood. He breathed again, in time with a machine he could not see. The next day, he took a personal day without calling it that. He woke, washed, dressed, and knew before he put his foot down what the day would be for. He would not have the wall on him in the shop. He would not go through the motions of answering to the cutter with the mind of a man in a stairwell. He called, spoke the words, heard a strict kindness in his boss's reply, and hung up with the sense of a door closing that he had opened. He stood there in his kitchen with the phone in his hand, and the monitor on the counter, and the noise machine on the chair, and the square on the table, and the world arranged around him in a constellation his own foolishness had charted. He bought a cheap stethoscope from the drugstore. He felt ashamed paying for it, as if he was stealing a prop from someone else's necessary play. The clerk bagged it the same as if it were cough drops. He took it home and sat with it like a talisman for a long minute. Then he walked into the hall and bent to the square and raised the earpieces and set the bell to the seam. The medical hollow sound of his own blood in his ears made a lake, and his name drifted on it like a blown leaf. He waited. He moved the bell along the line. He found a place where the sound caught and narrowed and turned thin. He held there. Under it and behind it and separate from the stupid drum inside his own head, he heard a small noise. He could not name it. It put him in mind of saliva, of a mouth too long open, of lips parted for breath that would not get enough. He went cold along the arms. He kept listening for longer than a reasonable person would have. He took the earpieces out and let them hang. He stood, and the motion light went out, and he felt a small relief at being no longer held in the bright by an eye that could not be seen. He replaced the square. He hung the stethoscope on the back of a chair, the way a person might hang a heavy necklace after wearing it a long time. He sat on the floor and lay down and listened without anything between. The crying did not return that day or the day after. It took something from him by withdrawing. He went to work with the sense of having missed an appointment he had not wanted, with someone he could not stand to disappoint. Days arranged themselves. He started to carry himself as a man does who has a private task he must accomplish at certain hours in a place where other people cannot see him. He woke and worked and came home and paused by the square and sometimes touched it and sometimes did not, and the small changes in that sequence took on a meaning he could not admit, even as he worked hard to get them just so. He ate less. He took to saving toast crusts on a saucer he hid under the sink, a foolish habit with no reason behind it. He rinsed the saucer out each night. He set it back, empty, and stood a moment, unsure what he had been about. The crying returned a week or a day later. His sense of time scraped thin. It returned low, and then found itself and then filled the hall like steam will fill a bathroom without your noticing until your mirror is gone. He stood, stunned by the relief that arrived with it, a relief so deep it made him angry. He pressed the heel of his hand to the seam. He spoke a word he did not choose. It was not hello. It was not hush. It was a noise a person might make without meaning to when confronted with the thing that refuses. He put his forehead to the paint and felt the cool there, and then the warmth from his own skin came back to him, a trick he hated and cherished for its plainness. He did not widen the opening that night. He stood his watch. He went inside and sat up. He rose before first light and went back and eased the square with a movement that had become as practiced and secret as another man is drink. He looked in and saw the hollow, and beyond it, nothing. He smelled the sweetness again, thinner, hardly there. He set his fingers along the edge where plaster met wood. He pushed gently at the seam. The wood moved no more than a letter slides under another letter when you shuffle envelopes. He felt something then, so quick he could have denied it to anyone, including himself. It was a press against the face of his fingers, light as breath. He froze. It pressed again, a touch with no weight, as if a thought inside had found the exact outline of his hand and wanted to check if the outline matched. He pulled back and set the square in place with a careful, ridiculous courtesy. He wiped his hand on his shirt and felt the grit. He put his thumb to his tongue and tasted dust and the iron of his own skin. He went inside and stood with his arms loose and his hands useless for a long time. When he finally lay down, he dreamed of a coin falling. It did not hit. The air carried it and carried it. He woke furious that the small mercy of the clatter had been denied. When the next notice appeared on the board, it said that the stairwell would be painted section by section over the coming month, and that certain landings might be blocked for hours. It advised residents to use the elevator when possible. It apologized for any inconvenience. He stood before that notice as if in church. He looked over at the elevator door and felt for a second that if he stepped in it, he would be moved to a floor where the version of himself who knew better about all things would meet him and deliver a lecture and a sandwich. He did not step into the elevator. He took the stairs and kept taking them because he had adjusted his life to them, and breaking that adjustment would be like taking a hand off a wound that has not scabbed. He found himself waiting for the painters the way prisoners must wait for the change of a guard. They cannot see, but can measure by the stretch of their own patience. When they came without fanfare. Two men with neat beards and the kind of conversation that passes between men who have worked next to one another long enough to say everything important beforehand. They brought drop cloths and tape that squealed when they pulled it, and small radios tuned just wrong enough to make you want to fix them. They taped and climbed and brushed and rolled, and the stairwell took on the clean, wet smell of new paint, a smell that sits right under your eyes and spreads a headache if you keep it there. He tried to be out during those hours. He stood in his kitchen with the window open and let the thin outside breeze bring him whatever it could steal from the day. The men painted past his square and did not ask about it. He thanked them for the work when they were near enough to hear gratitude. They nodded as if the words were on their list to receive and then moved on. When the paint dried, it dried a shade wrong the way new work always looks until the rest of life scuffs it down. The square looked like a scab again. He smoothed it with his palm and felt the small heat the day had put into the wall. He told himself he would stop. He knew he would not. He knew in the way a body knows before a mind permits it that there would be a moment very soon when he would do the thing he had been waiting to do since he first went down a flight with 2 store sacks and a key. He chose a night quiet as a library after closing. He turned the monitor face down on the table and shut the noise machine off. He pocketed the stethoscope without thinking about the ridiculous picture he made. He stood in the hallway, and the motion light judged him and turned on, and then, finding no reason, turned off. He set his palm on the wall, then took it away, then set it back. He lifted the square and leaned it against the baseboard like an old book. He widened the seam with his thumbs, as far as he could take it without chipping the new paint. He lowered the stethoscope bell into the hollow and listened. The little sound rose and fell, not crying but a smaller engine, the kind a person will hold to their own body to make sure it is still running. He took the bell away and slid his hand into the seam until his wrist was swallowed and his forearm cold. Then he waited. The touch came again. There was nothing to it and everything. It did not grasp. It did not cling. It pressed lightly along his first 2 fingers and then withdrew as if to measure. He lifted those fingers a hair, a small permission that made him want to weep. There was a pause. The pause held an age. The touch returned, not on his fingers this time, but on the back of his hand, like a head leaning, like weightless sleep. He did not pull away. He did not move deeper. He held, and in holding discovered he could carve a shape into the cold and live there a while. He thought of his sister's child. He thought of his own mouth forming a sound long ago in a kitchen, lit by one bulb when he had been small enough to be lifted. He thought of nothing at all. He let his mind leave. He let the building have him to the wrist, and then a little further. He waited until his hand numbed and then came back to itself as blood punched back through. He took his hand out gently so as not to scrape. He looked at his skin in the hall light. There were no marks. He had not expected marks. He had expected something else, and had gotten exactly what he should have expected, which was both too much and not enough. He sat with his back against the wall and waited to feel ashamed. It did not come. He felt large and hollow at the same time, as if he had been used as an instrument and liked it. He replaced the square carefully, like tucking a child. He stood and leaned for a second until his shoulder blade found the place it had made before. He went inside and drank water in slow mouthfuls and found that the water tasted like water again. He washed the glass and set it upside down and blessed its round sound when it took the counter. He did not sleep long. He woke before the light had decided to announce itself. He dressed in the same slow order as if for work and did not go to work. He went to the hall. He peeled a bit more paint, widened the seam just a hair, and slid his hand back in with the blind trust of a man who has made up his mind to be a certain thing in a world that has given him too few things to be. The touch came without delay. He let it travel along his knuckles, up the little ridge of bone where a boy once split his skin on a fence. He let it find his pulse. He let the building teach him the slow trick of staying as long as he was asked to stay. He began, after that, to arrange his days around what he would have called an appointment, if anyone had asked. Mornings early, evenings late, he would stand and open and slide his arm to the place where he could stand it and hold. And the thing inside, or the nothing that felt like a thing, would make its light contact. He would pull back when the skin along his forearm had gone to pins, or when the foot of a neighbor came into the stairwell, and he felt the shame he had not felt when alone. He replaced the square each time with a neatness that would do him credit in another context. He cleaned his fingertips on a cloth kept nearby and put the cloth to wash more often than it needed. He ate when he remembered to. He cut paper at the shop and found himself bringing the knife down soft, as if the touch in the wall had taught him a different measure for sharp. He noticed in all of this a thinning of the world beyond the stairwell. The streets felt drawn farther apart. Numbers on bills and signs refused to hold meaning on first glance. He had to say the day name aloud to hold it in his head. He did not speak much, and when he did, his voice sounded used seldom, like a hinge after long quiet. The neighbor with the little dog nodded to him with more concern than before. The woman who wore earplugs opened her door once as he passed and saw his square set aside and shut it more quickly than politeness called for. He felt neither accused nor defended by these small moves. He felt placed. He started to bring small things to the wall as if in gratitude, or as if to bribe it to go away. He could not have said which. A clean washcloth damp at the corner, a saucer of water set on the floor with both hands like an offering. He kept his success to himself. The water did not move, did not sink, did not pull. The cloth took the print of his own fingers and nothing else. He took these reports well because they told him that physics was still physics and he had not stepped entirely into a story. The inspectors did not return. The painters finished their work and took their radios and their tape and their clean cans away and left the stairwell bright as a hospital for a week. The brightness dulled, as all brightness does under hands and shoes. The square, with its edges lifted, drew a softer shadow. He smoothed it with his palm each time by reflex. He leaned his shoulder against the spot his shoulder knew. He breathed and weighted his measures and gave his hand. He stopped bringing the stethoscope because it told him only what he already knew and made him feel foolish for having wanted certainty. His sleep narrowed. He found himself awake in the thin bands of time when other people's night machines clicked and their kettles did their tiny gurgle before they were shut, the private timings of lives he did not share. He dreamed when he nodded that his arm had grown long and had passed through the wall entire to a place without rooms. He could not picture this place. He woke grateful he could not picture it. He woke angry that he could not. The weather turned hard for a run of days. The building creaked in a different key. The hallway air went colder and cleaner. The hollow at the seam sighed in and out of his reach and made him aware of his own ribs. The crying returned, soft and steady, the way a song reappears at a part of the day you learn to dread. He took it as a call. He answered with the only language that had worked between them. He kept his words out of it. He gave his hand and kept his arm from shaking by setting his shoulder hard against the cinder block on the opposite wall. On a night when wind made the stairwell sound like a flute, he pressed deeper than he had. He did not intend to. Something in him leaned. The seam took the first inches of his arm and then more. He felt the edge catch the hair along his skin and did not flinch. He slid until his elbow found the corner of the old board and met it, and could not go farther. The touch met him there along his forearm. It felt like a face turned towards sleep, weightless and certain. He pressed his forearm very gently against it as if to say, "Here, here." His fingers found nothing to take hold of and were grateful not to find it. He stayed like that long enough to forget how to count to himself. He started to say aloud, once in a while, the little phrases people say to infants they cannot yet see. He started to hush the air without meaning to hush it. This did not make him proud or ashamed. It made him feel located in a story where the same small noises had been made through long years by many mouths, and that those mouths had not been made foolish by the repetition, because the repetition was what held the floor underfoot. He said, "Easy now," and the air did not grow easy. He said, "There you are," and he did not know where there was. He expected rage and did not get it. He expected a turning from the wall to the people around him. He did not turn. He thought of calling his sister, of describing the shape of the thing, of hearing her laugh and then not laugh. He did not call. He thought of moving, of finding a place without a seam and a square and a board. He knew he would only carry the seam and square and board in his head to the new place and would stand there braced against a wall no one else could see until that wall learned what he had started here. He stayed. He dreamed again in a way that woke him so fast he had to hold onto the counter to let the room finish arriving. In the dream, there had been a building like his, but wider, and the stairwells were hollow like the bones of birds, and inside those hollows, a sound ran like a wire carrying current, and people in the building kept their own appointments with their own sections of wall, and no one spoke, and the city outside made allowances the way a city does for a parade. He woke and laughed hard enough to scare himself, and then hardened that laugh until it became breath again. He went to the wall as he always did. He slid the square away. He reached. He found the place. The touch came. It pressed, then withdrew, and in withdrawing took from him something he had laid there without knowing. He could have named it. He chose not to. He could have called it fear or purpose, or the long, slow beating that had kept him soft toward himself. He chose not to examine the lack too closely. He let the hollow cool his arm, and then took his arm back and rubbed it with both hands like a man who has been out in weather and wants to bring himself back into a house. The day the city cut water to the river road for most of a morning, the stairwell held a silence that made his teeth feel loose. He stood in the hall with the square up and the seam breathing a shallower air, and he heard nothing from inside. The air was dead, like a violin hung on a wall where no one plays. He felt a rise of panic so sudden he had to sit. He put his head low. He did the small thing he could do, which was to wait the way you stand at a window for a person to come down a walk. When the water came back and the building took its deep drink and the pipes flexed, the hollow gave a sigh. And then the smaller engine somewhere inside the wall found itself. He cried once, a dry hiccup of a sound that took him by surprise. He covered his mouth with knuckles and stayed like that until he had wrapped the sound inside him again. He began to imagine endings. He did not stoop to make them tidy. He pictured the landlord with the inspector and two men in a truck taking the wall apart to find a nest of lint the size of a cradle, to find wiring that had rubbed wood for years, until the building itself learned a voice and took a liking to hearing it to find nothing at all. He pictured fire, a kind he would recognize from childhood safety films, moving quiet as a person asleep down the chase, and he pictured himself with his hand in the wall and not taking it out in time. He pictured a hammer taken to the seam and the hammer finding no purchase because the seam had never been meant to open, and he pictured himself tapping endlessly like a man in a dream, waking his neighbors, and the neighbors deciding together that they had to call someone, and that someone arriving with a paper that said "Stay out" and a length of yellow tape that would make the stairwell not his any longer. He did not picture, not once, what it would mean to stop of his own accord. When the thing in the wall found a new sound late one evening, he named it in his head without wanting to. Laughter. It was not laughter. It was air moving through a tight place in a way that could be mistaken for laughter by a person determined to be fooled. He allowed himself to be fooled. He put the heel of his hand to the paint and smiled, and felt his mouth make that shape without permission. He removed his hand and set it back. He stood so long he went past hunger and tiredness and came into the thin place beyond. He traveled small in his own body across that place, the way a moth will jag against glass, until it finds the seam and slides through and thinks it has made a choice. He woke on the floor by his own door with the square against his hip bone like a book that had fallen from a nightstand. He remembered nothing of lying down. The hallway light clicked on and then, bored with him, clicked off. He stood like a man coming up from under. He carried the square into his apartment and set it on the table, then stood and looked at the table the way a person looks at the empty sink and knows they have been careful. He called the number on the board then, not in hope, but to handle the weight of the decision. The familiar patients answered. He gave his name and apartment. He said the wall. He said the sound. He said, using his words, that there was something in there. The voice said they could schedule a maintenance check in the coming days. The voice said to refrain from tampering. The voice thanked him for calling. He said thank you as well, and now he was laughing for real with no sound in it. He hung up and pressed his palm to the paint. He said aloud, not to the voice and not to himself, I could wait, and found that he could not. He chose an hour most people use for sleep. He brought a small pry bar wrapped in an old rag to keep it from scarring the new paint in a way that would show to eyes other than his. He lifted the square and set it by his foot. He set the padded bar to the seam and eased and listened to the dry jaw of old wood, thinking about giving. He gave it time. He did not force. He felt the board ease faintly and then resume its stubbornness. He eased again. He held. He took his hand away and slid his fingers in, not cautiously now, but with the courage of a man returning to what he has already decided he will not escape. He went into the elbow and then, with a breath, to just past. The board's edge bit his skin, and he took that pain because it was a true pain with no story in it. Within, the touch came. It spread along his forearm and settled there like sleep. He could feel, with his skin and not his mind, a shape. It was no shape he could draw. It was the outline of an attention. It was the tender insistence of need without malice. There was no pull. There was invitation. He felt his own arm tremble and stilled it by bracing his boot against the baseboard. He set his forehead against the wall and waited. If a neighbor had come and thrown a switch and lit the hall, he would not have moved. If the elevator had heaved into duty and whined past, he would not have pulled back. He stayed, and the building stayed around him, and his breath and the small engine on the other side matched without his permission. When he finally pulled his arm free, he did it quickly, like a man snatching his hand away from a burner after realizing there is no kettle to warrant the heat. He replaced the square with a sound that seemed loud as a dropped pan. He turned away. He went inside and shut the door, and did not set the locks. He lay on the floor. He slept so hard he drooled, and the drool ran along the seam of the vinyl and into the place where always, even in the cleanest kitchens, there is a line of old dirt. He woke with a stiff neck and a gentle certainty that made his stomach go sour. He went to work and told his boss he would be leaving. The boss asked for a date, and he could not give one. And the boss nodded and said, "Take a few days if you need and come see me after." And there was mercy in that, a small human mercy that made his chest hurt. He took a few days. He filled them exactly as anyone would think he would. He rose, stood, opened, reached, stayed, withdrew, closed, breathed, drank water, napped, stood again. The crying wove in and out of those hours like a thread through a piece of cloth. Sometimes it stopped at the exact moment you would think it had to go on. Sometimes it went on past the moment you would forgive it. He put food in his mouth sometimes, and sometimes did not. He could not have described hunger without talking about walls. On the last night of his few days, a storm came down from the ridge with a hard, sudden drop in temperature you could feel with your teeth. The building gathered itself and spoke in all its little structural voices. He had the seam open before he knew he was going to open it. He went into the spot that had come to know the bones of his arm. He found, with the confidence of a practiced hand, the place where the touch would meet him. It met him. He pressed back with a gentleness his body could produce, even now. He pressed back and felt for the first time something like fingers. Not the squeezing of them, not the grasp, just the lay of them along his own. He would have told you that this was the way a person learns a chord on an instrument before they have the muscle, the way your hand looks like it belongs to someone else for one clean instant. He matched his fingers to that lay. He breathed. The motion light above the stair went out. In the dark, held there, he understood in a way that does not arrive with words that what had been waiting had not been waiting for a rescue. It had been waiting for a partner. In another life, this would have horrified him. In this one, it came like relief, and then like a grief for all the other ways he might have spent his days. He considered pulling away, and did not. He considered calling out, and knew the shape of his voice would break the alignment, and the small engine would stutter, and the beak of the board would bite him in a way he might resent. He stayed. Time did what it does when a person stays too long in a place like this. It went out from under him. He did not notice at first the small sounds at the far end of the hall. Shoes, a bag set down, two human voices exchanging end-of-day words. He did not notice the elevator sigh and open and take someone in. He did not notice the way his own door had drifted an inch from its jamb as if wanting to be involved. He noticed only, for a few rolling breaths, the exact shape of his own hand being taught back to him. When he did finally hear the footstep close by, he did not move in time. He turned his head and saw the neighbor with the little dog standing half in the stairwell and half out, the dog a dark loaf against his shin, the neighbor's eyes very wet indeed. The neighbor lifted his hands to his own chest as if to say, "I see and I do not see." And he took one step back the way a person will step back on a slope to find their balance. He said nothing. He waited. He did not call out. He did not move toward or away. His doing nothing was the best kindness available. The little dog, for the first and last time, made a sound. A small, thin cry like a door hinge, and then closed his mouth as if surprised by himself. The neighbor gave a nod you could read as "This is none of my business, and as I wish I had something to say." He turned and went down one flight. The lights, having decided they were under no obligation to see to any of this, stayed off. He pulled his arm free, slow, like a man taking his hand from under a sleeping head. He replaced the square as if it were a fragile cover on a machine that, if left open, would pull him in. He went inside and shut his door and threw the locks forward without noise. He stood with his back to the door and laughed a laugh that had no humor but had plenty of air. He washed his hand and forearm with the care of a surgeon. He dried them with the towel he had set long ago on the radiator. He went to bed because there was nothing else to do that did not involve breaking anything that could be repaired. He slept one of those sleeps that feel like being pressed between layers and woke with a clarity he had not had in weeks. He understood in that clarity that he had crossed from listening to participating, and that the distance between those is not measured in words, but in the shapes your body has learned and refuses to unlearn. He dressed and went to work and told the boss he would take the days the boss had offered. The boss took it well. He said, "Take care," and the words stung just where care should have lived. He spent the day away from the building. He walked the low streets and crossed the river and stood by the water and watched it carry twigs and a plastic bottle and a branch the length of a man to a place where he could not follow. He bought coffee in a place with the wrong lights and drank it in 3 gulps because it tasted like nothing and everything all at once. He thought of a plan, and the plan was that there would be no plan. He returned to his building in the early evening when the salmon light across the shale lot makes everything look more tender than it has any right to. He nodded to 2 people he had never seen. He climbed and made himself stop on the landings to look out the wired windows as if it mattered. He stood before the square for a long time without moving it. The crying was not present. The small engine was. He slid the square up at last. He set his arm in. He went to the place. He waited. He felt the fingers lay lightly along his own. He felt them move, not at his direction. He heard then a sound he had not allowed himself to expect. It came from the hollow and also from his own mouth. A breath out, a long one, a relief. He realized with a sensation like an elevator arriving that he had learned the other timing so well that his chest now took its cues from it. He breathed when it breathed. He waited when it waited. He could keep waiting a long time this way. He did not disappear. He did not die. He went on, a man with a job and a habit, a man who knew which stores put their delivered milk on the shelf too early, a man who could tell by the smell of heated metal when a press would miss a line. He went on and gave his hand at appointed hours. He found that the crying lessened in proportion to the steadiness of his staying, and this taught him a terrible charity. He stopped wanting it to end. He stopped wanting himself back. He adjusted to the knowledge that this could go on as long as his hand could learn to stay warm inside cold and then warm again. He built his days around that fact, and all the little noises of life, the hum of the fridge, the click of the hallway light waking to an empty hall, the soft skitter of his own shoes on paint, came to mean exactly what they had all along, except that now they were appointed to him. There came a night in the colder months when something changed. It was not a large thing. On his way down the stairs with his trash, he heard from the lower landing a sound like a television turned very low in a language he did not know. He went down and saw the landlord standing with 2 men in the utility room, the door propped open. The men had headlamps and a brand of careful that comes with training and a pension. The landlord glanced up and gave him the nod a man gives to another man who has been fair to him even if he has been a nuisance. One of the men in the headlamps said there had been reports of sound and that they were tracing ducts. He said a lot of words that meant nothing by themselves, but one of those words was chase. He would remember that later. He went upstairs with his trash and put it down in his own bin without opening the door to the chute. He stood in his kitchen and listened to the men below move through a set of actions set down long before in a folder. He went to the hall and stood by his square and felt the small engine in the hollow like a ticking heart in a small animal chest. He could not tell it anything that would help it, and it could not tell him what it required of him beyond what he had learned to do. The men were efficient. They left the door ajar. He stood at his place until the engine in the wall met his palm and then did not come to meet it again. He kept his palm there anyway. He held until the paint warmed. He pulled his hand out and replaced the square with hands that shook. He went down to the utility room and leaned in and asked in a voice he did not recognize whether they had found anything. One of the men said they had not found anything living. The landlord said they would keep at it in the morning. He did not ask what he had hoped to. He went back upstairs and stood in the hall with his ear to the seam like a boy again, and heard nothing at all but his own stupid ocean. He slept, if sleep can be the word for lying in place while the body does an imitation of rest. He woke early and went to work early to escape the hour when things change. He cut paper too fast. He nicked a stack. He swore and did not care that the word landed in a room where it would land and stick. He finished and went outside and stood by the dumpsters and watched steam come from the vents in a building that no longer shied at showing its workings. He went home at midday because the hours had lost their hooks. Upstairs, the square waited. He did not move it. He could not. He sat on the top step and rubbed the heel of his hand and felt the phantom of a face there. This embarrassed him. He laughed at himself in a way that did not cure anything. He stood long enough for the light to turn off. He stood in the dim and did not take his place. He went into his apartment and shut his door with the feeling a person gets closing a door on a room where someone is sleeping, careful, trying not to catch the latch. He turned on the television and the sound drove through him like a bad tooth. He turned it off. He sat and breathed. He waited for nothing to become something again. In the late evening, he tried. He lifted the square. He widened the seam. He slid his hand into that cool breath. He went to the familiar place and waited. At first there was nothing, which is worse than silence, because nothing can be made into anything by the wrong kind of will. He made himself have no will. He let his hand be a hand. He breathed the way the building had taught him. After an age that could be minutes or hours, the touch returned. It found him without uncertainty. It was lighter than before. It laid along his knuckles like a memory he had been kind to. He held it and made a sound he would never make in front of anyone whose opinion he valued. He lowered his forehead to the paint and cried without crying. He held until the thing withdrew, not because of any interruption or decision, but as if to say that was enough. He drew his arm out and leaned against the wall with the same old posture and looked at the square in his hand and saw that his fingernails had turned grey with paint dust. He blew on them and paint lifted in a little storm and settled on his shoes. He set the square in place, crooked, then straightened it. He went inside. He made food. He ate it. He washed everything he had dirtied. He dried them and put them where they belonged. He did this with a gratitude that was worse than hunger. He kept on like that. The men from the utility room did not come back for his section of wall. The landlord left a notice about a change in the snow policy. The neighbor with the dog moved out one day with the exact quiet you would expect from a man like that, and a new person moved in with the noise of all new people. The woman who wore earplugs let her earplugs fall down the hallway one evening and did not see them. And he picked them up and rapped on her door to return them, and she said thank you in a voice that said she did not know if she recognized him. He recognized everyone. He recognized the building when it made its throwaway noises. He recognized himself only by the shape of his hand. The last thing came on a night that would not have stood out to anyone who does not live in a stairwell. He stood at his place and opened and slid his arm in and met the touch. It stayed longer than it had lately. He let it. He felt the little weightless press rise and fall along his hand. He felt once the faintest pressure where a thumb might be if a thumb were there. He pressed back with an answering thumb in the air he could not see. The answering press moved, not away, but into another place on his hand, as if testing for fit. He shivered the way a man will shiver in a church. He was not a church man. He did not care about redemption. He cared about the exactness of this. He matched the press. and waited. The motion light clicked off. He understood then, with a simplicity that would have insulted him months before and now saved him, that there would be no end that looked like a solved problem. There would be only this work, which was not work as a person counts it, and the building would keep its baby, or keep its sound, or keep its hollow, and he would keep his appointment until one of them stopped in the way all things stop. He pulled his arm free with ceremony. He set the square back and smoothed it. He pressed his shoulder to the wall one last time, as if checking the temperature of a sleeping child. He went into his apartment. He turned off the noise machine. He unplugged the monitor. He set both in a drawer and slid the drawer shut and felt the small roll of the runners catch and then let go and then catch. The song of a piece of furniture that has learned it's human. He lay down and the building breathed. And he breathed, and the breath went on across the gulf he had taught himself to cross. Some nights after that, other residents would stop in the stairwell with grocery sacks pressed against their hips and say to one another, "Do you hear that?" Most would not. Some would stand with their heads cocked for a polite number of breaths and then shake them and go on. A few would hold still long enough to catch the thin call, low and at the edge, the kind of sound that makes you feel like your ears are lying. They would make a note to themselves to tell the landlord if it kept up. It would not keep up in a way that could be described on a note. It would come and go and shape the steps a person took without that person wanting to admit their steps had been shaped. It would sit in the seam of days, the way a hair sits in paint on a baseboard, half seen, part of the place now. In his kitchen, the glass he drank from held a faint ring where he set it in the same spot each night after washing it. He would lift it in the morning and see the circle and think of circles and put the glass down. A finger's breadth to the left to start a gentler second ring and then a third, until the counter showed a small constellation you would not notice unless you had taught yourself to notice the life of quiet things. The fridge hummed and paused and hummed. The radiator ticked and held. The hallway light took its time and then caught and made its rounds. He moved through all of it with a patience people would have called odd if they had known him before. They did not know him before. When the wind set to its winter work and pushed against the shale lot and came up the stairwell like a ghost you would not believe in if you had a choice. He slept with his hand pressed under the pillow where it could learn again the lesson of staying. He would wake and find the other side of his hand warmed, the way a child's cheek warms the fabric it presses. He would rise, as always, and boil water and pour and stand at the sink and watch the steam soften the window glass. He would walk the hallway and lay his palm on the paint, not to open, but to let the wall know he was at his post. He would do this without drama for a long time. He would do it until it made no sense in language, but made perfect sense in the way he held himself upright. On a morning that might have been any morning, someone left a new notice on the board asking residents to refrain from propping doors because a draft down the stairwell was tripping the furnace. He read it and felt affection for the carefulness of the words. He pressed the tape smooth, though he knew it would curl. He carried his mail upstairs. He paused by the square and did not move it. He stood for the space of 2 breaths with his shoulder to the wall, and the building, patient as ever, pressed back the smallest amount. That was all. That was enough. The light behind him, having watched him long enough, clicked off. The dark was deeper by a hair, like paint laid over paint. He stood in it and knew his measurements by feel, and then he moved on. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.